Tonight the room is dim and calm, and a small blue point waits on the far side of the glass. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't flare. It just hangs there, a soft ember of light that keeps its shape while the rest of the sky drifts by. I steady my voice to that patient glow and set a hand on the desk, letting everything else fall a step quieter. Before we wander farther, make the space kind to you. Slip on headphones if you like, set Do Not Disturb, lower the screen a touch. Cue the Sleepy Science playlist so the next chapter follows without you needing to lift a finger. Let your shoulders ease toward the chair and let the day unclasp. We will spend a while with a visitor that brightens without the showy sweep of a tale, a modest beacon that asks more questions than it answers. I won't rush the facts or the feelings. I'll keep the language slow and plain, like a lamp turned low in a hallway you know by heart. We'll touch what's observed, then what seems plausible, and set the rest on the windowsill to breathe in the cool. You don't need to keep anything in your hands. If a detail wanders off, it can wander. The sky will hold our place. The point is not to solve, but to notice. To notice how the light gathers and how it refuses to hurry. To notice how steady attention makes its own warmth. I'm here beside you, keeping time with that blue, keeping the steps small and even. We begin. I guide your gaze the way a dimmer slides, slow and certain, across the frame. The field is calm. Stars are needle-fine, each with its tidy point-spread dress, and in the middle sits a soft sphere of light with edges that will not fray. You would expect a sweep, a trailing veil, a bright plume drawn away from the sun. Instead, the glow stays gathered, a quiet halo keeping its own counsel. I let the halo hold our attention. Its blue is not a shout, but a cool tint, like frost seen under a lamp at dawn. The core looks compact in every stacked exposure, just wide enough to be itself, just diffuse enough to whisper that it is not a star. Around it there is no stitched ribbon of dust, no fan of gas that widens with distance. The background remains clean, and that cleanliness is its own kind of message. Names help the hands rest. We call this visitor 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object found crossing our sun's light after Wani, Oumuamua, and 2I, Borisov. It is the newest chapter in a slim book that grows by single lines. Oumuamua passed without a visible tail and nudged arguments about subtle forces. Borisov arrived with an ordinary bloom, proof that comets from other suns can behave like our own. 3I sits between those stories, bright enough to notice, quiet enough to unsettle the usual picture. Behind the sun, it slipped, and then it reappeared with a firmed-up shine. The blue deepened a little, like a sheet of glass turned a few degrees toward the lamp. Light curves stayed steady, not flat as iron, but steady enough that our notebooks filled with the same numbers night after night. Across continents, instruments compared notes. The core remained tight. The space around it stayed free of a long, luminous wake. I moved the view slowly, pixel to pixel, like a fingertip on frost. In high resolution, the profile hugs the telescope's idea of a point. When we stretch contrast, the glow does not bloom into a tail. It simply becomes a slightly larger aura, a lantern with no smoke. If trailing material is present, it hides outside the band of our eyes, or it refuses to scatter in the way that turns dust into a painterly stroke against the dark. Let's place small, careful thoughts beside what we can see. If the surface carries a refractory crust, rock dark, sun hardened, then gas trapped beneath might struggle to find a way out. light would climb from the skin rather than from a larger cloud, leaving the frame as clean as we find it now. If the grains that do escape are larger than the fine powders that love to glow, they may shed momentum in silence, too heavy to form a sweeping line of light. Another gentle thought concerns direction. If the object's spin axis points close to our line of sight, any shy outflow could be aimed mostly toward or away from us. Its light sketched on the sky as a tight circle rather than a drawn ribbon. The halo we see would then be real, not a trick, but it would be the whole show, and the empty background would simply be geometry's soft joke. Notice how the halo keeps its mood even as the angle to the sun slowly changes. The color trend does not race, it drifts, like a dimmer easing toward cooler tones. We register the change, mark times in universal seconds, and let the log stay unhurried. Quiet frames teach patience, and patience keeps the mind from inventing what the sensor did not see. Take a minute for the room itself. The monitors wash a faint silver onto the keys. The star field slides a millimeter on the screen every few heartbeats. Air is low and steady. A desk lamp holds its circle without buzzing. The glow on the glass is thin as breath, and somewhere beyond the window, the real sky carries the same image in a scale so large it turns thinking into simple seeing. The halo keeps its center. The darkness around it is gentle and wide. It helps to say the safe things out loud. The path is hyperbolic, which is another way of saying it is not bound to our sun's gravity, and the closest pass to Earth is far, farther than the distance from here to the sun by a good margin. There is no hazard in this study, only the pleasure of careful measurement and the quiet sport of letting evidence erase worry. What if the light is only the surface speaking and the rest keeps its counsel? I tilt the image and look for asymmetry, a brighter wing, a subtle elongation that would betray dust swept by radiation pressure. The fit stays friendly. The shape does not argue with the model of a compact halo, and the margins of error behave as margins should. It is not that a tail is forbidden by nature, it is that tonight the light refuses that costume, showing us a different script where reflection stands alone and the usual flourish never arrives. From this, our goal is not verdict but vocabulary. We give the sky the words it earns, no more. The halo is quiet, the profile is tight, the color leans blue, the distance is safe, the track is outward. Somewhere inside those 5 notes, the object carries a history we cannot touch, and yet, by looking carefully, we feel the warmth that attention makes, a human light that meets the starlight without crowding it. The blue you see now isn't a signal in the dramatic sense. It's a tone, a bias, a preference the surface shows as it turns under sunlight. Tomorrow, it may look the same. Next week, it may settle a shade paler. All we can do tonight is keep the gaze steady and let the frame breathe, trusting that a halo with no tail can still teach us how to see with less story and more light. And as the minutes pass, the color softens by a breath, sliding from steel blue toward a lighter wash, as if the dimmer moves one more notch toward morning. The spectrograph keeps time. It opens its shutter, breathes a measured silence, and closes again. A fan hums under the bench like a low cello. The exposure counter climbs toward 900 seconds, then clears to begin again. I find myself speaking in its tempo, each thought shaped by that patient beat. Filter wheels click from one slot to the next, and the room answers with a soft relay tap. We spend a pass in R, another in I. Then, let Z gather the longer red, where the night is kinder to faint things. When the near-infrared arm wakes, the detector settles, dark current mapped and subtracted, and the clock slips back into its steady circle. Nothing in the object demands a rush, and the instruments reward that choice. On a separate console, the photometry script plots as each frame lands. The curve errs on the side of calm, a shallow ripple rather than a set of teeth. Variation is present, but it is small, the kind of swing that feels like room tone rather than melody. I mark the deltas and leave a margin for weather, optics, and the simple mood of the night. Spectra arrive in bands, each with its own heartbeat. We look to the usual places where comets speak: cyanogen, carbon monoxide, water's fragments in the near IR. The lines where a tail would announce itself stay thin or absent. The flats subtract cleanly, and the residuals refuse drama. That refusal is not an empty thing. It's a bracket around what the sky does not show us yet. I shift the cadence by half a step and check calibration frames, lamps glowing inside their housings, the whisper of a motor that has learned patience from the sky. The objects we track do not care about our clocks, yet our clocks are how we listen. The spectrograph is literal about that. Every long inhale of photons is written as seconds, and the seconds become the story. Ambience settles mid-room, the hush behind the fans, a faint, even thrum in the building's ribs, the quiet click as a thermal sensor finds equilibrium, distant air across a vent, then stillness returning between pulses. Each sound is a page turned very slowly, soft enough that you hear the space more than the paper. Nothing new happens, and that is the comfort. When the hush recedes a half step, I lay our sights over one another. Chile breathes with the Pacific, the Canaries with a different sea, and yet the plots line up like well-behaved metronomes. Cameras with different tempers look at the same object and agree on the lack of a sweeping trail. The agreement is not a verdict, it is a baseline, a thin line we can lean on without leaning too hard. Coordinated runs earn their own rhythm. One team advances through R band, while another holds in the near IR. Lives of glass and aluminum fold into a shared measure. Times are kept in UT, and the logs hum with the same initials, the same commas, as if the whole network had chosen minimal punctuation so the sky could expand into the silence it needs. In the small hours, the radio clock ticks exactly when the dome rotates, and I feel the lab listening through the instruments rather than through me, which is the point. Upper limits are written in the quietest ink. We do not say no gas or no dust. We say that if either is there, the flux hides beneath thresholds set by noise, by sky brightness, by the simple finite appetite of detectors. It is a posture of care, and it keeps our speech from outpacing what the spectra will support. In that posture, a non-detection becomes a room in which later detections, if they come, will have a place to sit. I think about exposure length the way I think about breath. Short frames are sips, long ones are slow drinks that let faint structure declare itself if it wants to. Tonight, the slow drinks reveal a compact glow that prefers to be counted rather than sketched. If there is outflow, it may be the kind that the visible bands treat as a rumour, while other wavelengths wait their turn to listen in. Cross-checks continue. A pipeline at one site smooths fringes. A pipeline elsewhere prefers to model and subtract the background field. The two meet in the middle, their answers not identical, but sibling close. And in that nearness we gain confidence in the outline of the story without pretending to have written its ending. The data are careful with us when we are careful with them, and the spectrograph's clock makes sure we remember how care sounds. Later in the night, I reread the flats and arcs, trusting the lamps the way sailors trust the steady flash of a distant buoy. Not for drama, but for orientation, because consistency is the instrument's way of telling the truth. I page through notes about slit widths and seeing conditions, how the entrance slit accepts or loses light as the air wavers, and how all of that adds up to whether a thin trace rises above the floor or snugs back into it. There is a long sentence hiding in the rhythm, and it goes like this. When exposure after exposure lands with the same shallow curve, when bands most likely to host comet gas-day plane, when independent telescopes draw the same soft silhouette with different hands, I let the weight of matching seconds be my evidence that tonight's story is steadiness written in sound more than in blaze, caution written in numbers more than in adjectives. The machines do not care about our metaphors. They obey their voltages and their thermals and their firmware, and in that obedience is the mercy we need to avoid the temptations of certainty. If we declare the absence of a tale, we do it with the small, exact voice of instruments, not the brass of a headline. The beat keeps us honest. Before the last sequence, I quiet the room again. A fan lowers a register. The relay taps once. The shutter opens into the long, featureless breath that means everything is working as intended. If what we seek is faint, this is how we will find it, not by willing it brighter, but by matching the tempo of the devices built to hear it. The exposure clock reaches its mark and clears. The spectrograph ticks once. If a visitor brightens, where is its tail? I let that one small question rest on the table between us, like a square of cloth waiting for light fingers. The frame on the screen is familiar now. A compact glow, a clean background, no sweep of dust stitched into the dark. The numbers agree with what your eyes feel. More light than before closest approach. Yet, nothing unspools behind it. We will not tug the question. We will smooth it once, and then again. One path through the puzzle is to imagine the surface as a sealed weave. Picture a fabric so tightly knit that what lies beneath cannot find a gap. Heat can loosen stitches in ordinary comets, and gas slips through to carry dust outward in a wide, bright drape. Here, the weave may be sun-hardened, grains fuse like fibers pressed under a warm iron, their seams reluctant to open. When such a skin faces the star, it may warm and shine without unraveling. Space is not kind to loose cloth. Over millions of years, the small blows and rays can sinter a layer into something closer to a crust than a fleece, a face that looks soft at a distance, but resists from up close. If that crust exists, gas trapped in the lining can only seep where the stitching failed, and if the faults are tiny or rare, the seep stays local, the halo stays compact, and the frame stays simple. The light would then be reflection from the topmost threads more than a plume from a torn panel. Another path is geometry. Think of a ribbon held edge-on to your eye. It's still a ribbon. It simply hides its width. If the spin axis of our visitor points near our sightline, any faint outflow could be arranged around the pole in a tight collar, its light drawn inward by perspective. You would not see a banner. You would see a circle, a modest fringe that does not reach into a tail. Turn the ribbon, and the cloth grows wide. Hold it edge on, and the cloth becomes a line. A third path is grain. Dust loves to scatter when it is very fine, like muslin in strong sun. Coarser grains behave like heavy canvas. They do not billow in optical light. Millimeter to centimeter fragments can leave a surface, and yet fail to bloom into the gleam we call a tail, simply because their scattering is weak and their weight keeps them close, more ballast than flare. If such grains dominate, the camera will read brightness without the answering brushstroke. The room settles into a still weave of its own. Air slips through a vent in a long, even line. Keys hold a soft warmth under the hands. A pencil rests where the hand left it, its wooden body faintly cool. The monitor's glow lays a pale rectangle on the desk, like a patch sewn onto a favourite sleeve. Beyond the glass, the night is matte and broad, with a few bright pinholes stitched across it. Nothing moves fast. Nothing asks you to keep up. Back on the spectrum view, the places where comet gas usually speaks remain quiet. Cyanogen's narrow lines, fragments from water broken under light, carbon monoxide that loves the cold. If they are present, they stay below the cloth of noise we cannot peel away tonight. Upper limits are not a flourish. They are the hem that keeps our words from fraying. We note the limits, tighten the statements, and leave room for the bands we have not yet sewn into the set. The question returns, patient and unthreatening. If the weave is sealed, the pressure beneath might build and release in pinpricks, too fine to throw a sheet of dust into the field. If the ribbon is edge-on, the small collar of outflow would overlap itself in our line of sight, a compact cuff mistaken for a spotless circle. If the grains are too coarse to glitter, the light we count will act like it comes from a smooth panel, even if grains are drifting away at a pace we cannot weigh. We can try to pull on the threads of polarization and phase angle to see if the cloth shines differently with each tilt of the star. We can return at wavelengths where heavy grains glow by their warmth rather than by reflected sun, testing whether what is not bright invisible light leaves a warmer print in the infrared. None of this is a promise. It is a measured way to keep the needle quiet, while we add careful stitches around the hole where an easy answer would be. Every night adds to the quilt. Some patches are plain, some patterned, and some arrive with nothing but the right size to make the whole hold together. What we sew from one eye and two eye, and from this blue glow, is not a single fabric, but a set of swatches that let the hand learn the difference between a loose weave and a sealed one, between a cloth that breathes and a cloth that holds. The lesson is slow, and the slowness is friendly. You do not need to remember the names stitched into each panel. You can let the question sit where it began and notice how we treat it. We do not pull hard. We smooth from the center to the edge. We watch for any stitch that lifts. And we accept that a halo can brighten in the same breath that a tail refuses to appear, which is another way of saying the surface can speak while the lining stays still. Here is a long, even thought to carry us. When the light rises without the flourish of a tail, and the spectral places where gas would declare itself remain plain, and the images from different domes draw the same unadorned circle, I move through the options like fingers over cloth, sealed weave suppressing outflow, edge on ribbon hiding its breadth, coarse grains refusing to glitter, and I find that letting several small answers share the frame makes a quieter, truer picture than forcing one large one to stand alone. so the question can stay as a gentle seam in the story. It doesn't snag, it doesn't split the panel. It reminds us that patient hands keep fabric whole even when a thread shows. I'll keep smoothing it as the nights change, and if the weave loosens, we will see that too. And if it holds, the halo will go on speaking in its compact, careful way. If the sealed weave keeps its shape, what will the next faint change in light want us to call it? I post a card from the hours near closest sun, a small message carried across the bright roadway between star and shadow. On the picture side, the traveller clears the bend and keeps going, not rushing, not stumbling, just holding a steady pace across the light. Colours lean cooler after the turn. The blue comes forward the way dawn gains the road line by line, not all at once. The frame stays tidy, a compact glow in the middle, the margin untroubled by a plume. We had packed for crowded lanes and dust in the air. The lane we found was open and smooth. An outburst never met us at the pass. We set the exposure tent and waited, expecting the ordinary bustle of a comet's busy crossroads, and the hour unfolded like a quiet interchange after midnight. The halo brightened, yes, but the wide stream of dust that often follows such traffic never appeared. Headlights without a caravan. I think about depth rather than distance. Heat walks the surface like a traveller who keeps to the shoulder, penetrating only so far before turning back toward the sky it came from. Beneath that shallow walk, the interior stays colder, a town asleep while the highway hums above. Light can change the skin without waking what lies farther in. The next mile marker is rotation. The light curve suggests a day measured in many hours, not a spinning coin, but a slow wheel rolling along the lane. A wheel like that keeps load steady. It does not fling gravel into the air. The brightness rises and falls, with a restraint that matches the story we've been telling the whole drive. Our map is stamped with corners and times, universal minutes in the margins, site names in small print. I flip through them and see the same waypoint repeating, colour leaning blue, profile near the expected shape, no tail sketched by the wind of sunlight. Different roads leading to a single crossroads. The postcard gains its caption one neat letter at a time. The night offers a still pull-off late in the drive. Air glides along ducts like a car easing past markers. The dome settles as if a brake were let out gently. A distant transformer hums like tires on far asphalt. The room holds its lane, quiet and loyal. Even the scribble of pencil on paper feels like stripes passing under a steady speed. Thermal ideas keep me company for the rest of this leg. The skin warms, expands a little, contracts as the star angles shift. Small stresses appear and ease. And if there are hidden seams, they might open only as thin as a thread before closing again. If any dust escapes through such a seam, the grains may be too large to loft into a shining wake, more like pebbles staying near the shoulder than sparks thrown far behind. I revisit the hour markers from before and after the turn around the sun. The field was tidy then. The field is tidy now. If the traveller carried a reservoir of gases ready to run, that crossing would have been the on-ramp. Instead, the journey continued, like a car with full discipline, headlights clear, no fog of exhaust swirling in its wake. There's a long, even road in this thought. When the crest is behind us, and the instrumentation from different hills and coasts still draws the same compact light, with no fan. when the color shift arrives without the usual freight of gas lines, and when the candidate spin is slow enough to treat the surface like a careful driver treats a curve. I am content to mark this stretch of miles as orderly travel on a bright, empty highway, with the promise that if new signs appear farther on, we will slow to read them. We aren't racing the object. It would not help if we tried. We are matching its pace with our notebooks and letting the route teach us where to look next. Another pass in the infrared here, a polarization turn there, a longer set of photometry down the straightaway. The road rolls under the tires, and we stay awake without hurry. For now the card is simple. Closest sun crossed, blue tone held, no tail written in the margins. The return address is our quiet lab. The stamp is a small round of starlight. The note reads, in a hand you recognize, that the traveller remains itself after the pass and keeps to the centre of the lane, untroubled by a parade. I date the card, set it by the keyboard to dry, and watch the time settle like a milepost in the log. At a marked hour, we hold there. Night has a voice, and the dishes know how to hear it. The dome motors idle into a low murmur. The air system settles to a hush that sounds like velvet rubbed once and then smoothed flat again. The control room dims until the monitors become small ponds of grey-blue, and across the valley a radio antenna turns so slowly that its bearings make only the quietest click at the end of a long arc. The array drifts to a new pointing. A relay gives one respectful tap. Somewhere in the rafters, a cable shifts and forgets to complain. I match my breath to the room's pace, in through the soft roll of the fan, out with the faint hum of electronics warmed just enough to sing. It is a good night to listen for what does not rush to be found. Mid-infrared watches first, because warmth leaves a footprint even when dust refuses to glitter. The frames arrive clean and reserved, a few bright calibrators where they belong, then our field with its compact glow. If a thick plume were shedding heat, it would spill into these bands like a quiet drum you can still feel in your sternum. The plots stay gentle, like a fingertip on a tabletop that never taps. On the radio side, the tunings pass like slow notes. Windows, where common gases would hum, slip by without a clear chord. The instruments do not declare nothing. They declare this much and no more, this contour of quiet where a line would have risen if it wished. Limits are written in decibels and patience, and I run my finger along them the way you trace the groove of an old record. The network joins in at different latitudes, as if a low choir had learned to trade phrases without ever trying to be loud. Schedulers hand off times like rests. Clouds in one place are cancelled by clarity in another. Files travel with the soft percussion of keystrokes and the muted sigh of a progress bar completing its small journey. There is little to annotate. There is a great deal to keep. Non-detections can feel like a blank page if you expect headlines, but they are more like the foam inside a case that tells you which shapes have not been packed tonight, so you know what to look for next. An upper limit sets the ceiling on what could be hidden in the room. With enough ceilings, the room's size becomes knowable, even if no one has turned on the light. Midway through the watch, the building becomes very sure of itself. The floor settles 1 quiet millimeter. A door latch cools and shrinks with a tiny, polite tick. Outside, the wind forgets to bother the metal, and the antenna completes an arc so patient you could mistake it for stillness. In that long, even absence of events, your shoulders decide on their own to drop a little, and mine do too. I switch views and hear the soft arithmetic of the pipeline. Subtract, divide, weight, co-add. Each step a muffled footfall in a corridor carpeted to keep sleepers undisturbed. Each residual a whisper that says the sky is simpler than rumour, at least for now. Even the help notes keep their volume low. We are not talking ourselves into anything. We are talking ourselves out of haste. Here is a long sentence to match the room. When the spectrometers sweep past the familiar registers where excited molecules would ordinarily sing and find, instead of a chorus, the tempered breath of background. When the mid-infrared returns only a modest warmth that disappears into calibration, the way a soft chime disappears into rainfall. And when the cross-check stacks agree that the glow stays compact without a haze, I hear in that shared restraint a careful, many-instrument verdict that says, not no, but not yet above this gentle line where night itself begins. And I write that line down. Silence can tempt grandness, so I practice the opposite. I let the keyboard stay idle for a minute and listen to the systems do what they were built to do. The relay will tap no louder for my curiosity. The dish will not hurry for my questions. The sky will not change its mind because we are ready to understand it. Quiet teaches scale. If you are still awake beside me, you can borrow this small technique. Imagine that the room's tiny sounds are the night reading itself aloud. Fan, relay, distant duct, a click, and that each sound is telling you which parts of the story do not need your effort. Your attention can lean back into the chair and still be fully here. The object is out there, and it is being patient. We can afford to match it. I write one more line in the log and let it be ordinary. Bands swept, lines under limit, continuum quiet, calibration sound. Somewhere in that ordinariness, meaning a cruise, because when night after night the same quiet repeats, the quiet itself becomes a feature, not a lack, and we are allowed to call it knowledge without raising our voices. The dish completes a breath of metal. A fan draws a soft ribbon of air along the floor. The relay gives a tiny consonant, then sleeps. The room's own heartbeat spreads thin and even, a low note you feel more than hear. Far off, a vent trades a slow whisper with the corridor and loses interest. A pen rolls 1 centimeter and decides to stop. The mouse rests its weight like a small animal learning the shape of your hand. A cable in the ceiling remembers its curve. The monitors hum in their glass throats and do not change key. The night leans its ear to the building, finds the pitch, and holds it. Nothing asks to be louder. Nothing needs to be named. The air is a single tone, carried gently from wall to wall, and it is enough to keep us company while the sky turns. Begin on a single grain, a speck small enough to hide against a pixel's edge. Light meets it and decides how to behave. If the grain is far smaller than the wavelength, scattering leans to the short end, the way fine threads haze blue when skylight passes through thin cloth. If the grain is comparable to the wavelength or larger, the pattern grows complicated. Angles matter more, and brightness can look forward thrown and pale, or dull and even, depending on the twist of the fibre. At this scale, tails are not decided by names like comet or stone. They are decided by grain, by weave, by how sunlight catches on tiny edges. Stay close a moment longer. The surface may be a fabric piece from different bolts, dark, sun-cured patches, stitched to brighter, fresher swatches exposed by stress. If our visitor's skin wears such a quilt, the halo we see can be the sum of many small panels with different sheen, some reflecting more in blue, some in neutral tones, and still the whole could look compact if no seams yet open wide enough to vent a plume. We test that idea by reading the light curve as a pattern of panels turning past our line of sight. Small changes in brightness can be rotation across a patchwork, rather than eruptions from a single tear. Models that fit a modest amplitude with albedo differences tell us we don't need a loud fountain to explain the rhythm. A neat seam, a matte block here and there, a smooth panel slipping under the lamp may be enough. The room offers early quiet to match the small grain. Air glides along a duct and lays a single, even strand of sound across the ceiling. A cable makes a tiny memory of its own weight and forgets to move again. Keys wait like folded linen. The mouse is warm where a hand rested and cool where it did not. The building holds its breath, then releases it, then holds it once more, each cycle shallow and polite. Nothing presses, nothing pulls. The night lies flat as cloth on a table with the weave running true. Step back one pace. A halo this bright, under cautious assumptions about reflectivity, sketches a body in the kilometre class, a few across, perhaps nearer 5 than 1, though such estimates live and die by how polished or suited the surface is allowed to be. We are careful here. Change the assumed sheen and the yardstick shifts, but the feel stays the same. Not dust, not boulder, but a small world sewn tight. Step back again. The track through our sky is a curve that will not close, an orbit stitched as a single pass rather than a loop. A number named eccentricity sits above 1, which tells us the stitch won't tie. The thread runs on into the larger cloth between stars, and that is enough to say interstellar, without making the label carry more story than it can hold. Now step to the chart, where motion is explained by sums of pulls. Fit the path with gravity alone, and the residuals sit politely near the margins. Small mismatches that do not insist on extra terms. Some teams try a faint push from warmth or whisper-thin outflow and find no need. Others allow it and find the fit only drifts by a hair. In such a case, humility helps. The fabric of error bars can cover tiny forces without pretending they are woven in. Here is the long sentence that reaches from thread to cloth without snagging. When the light from a grain-scale surface can be told by the basic rules, fine, threads scattering toward blue, coarse fibers throwing light forward without sparkle, and when a patchwork turning under the sun explains the shallow rise and fall without inventing fountains, and when a cautious conversion from brightness to size lands us in the quiet middle of a few kilometers, rather than the edges of pebble or mountain, and when the orbital stitch refuses to tie because the curve is hyperbolic, and when motion solved by gravity is as smooth as a well-pressed seam with only tiny puckers at the edge, I let the object remain what the data allow it to be tonight. A tight, travelling piece of fabric whose glow comes mostly from its skin. We widen fully now. The halo's compactness says the weave still holds. The colour's nudge toward blue suggests either very fine top threads or fresh panels turned to the lamp. The size keeps the story scaled to a small world that can warm without boiling. Nothing in that set demands an invisible banner of dust. Nothing forbids a future change if a seam lets go. What remains are the commas of modelling, the faint asymmetries that may be air or instrument or the subtle lay of the cloth, and they are commas we honour by not pretending they are periods. The fit is good, the seams look tight, the thread runs straight enough to trust for now, and if warmth lingers in the skin like a fine mist held just beneath a chilled window, then the surface glows without spilling much into space. If that mist of heat seeps slowly through a dense outer layer, then pressure finds no easy path, and the night stays clean of sweeping plume. I watch the infrared points relax by small steps rather than drops. The cooling curve behaves like mist, thinning at dawn rather than rain spent in a rush. If thermal inertia is high, stone and metal sharing their hush, then yesterday's sunlight remains folded in the skin tonight, and what leaves does so as gentle warmth, not as loud gas. The places where molecules would draw narrow lines remain quiet, their seats empty, their names written in the margins, and nothing more. If the grains that do escape are large, they return light poorly to our eyes. Mist loves tiny droplets. Coarse spray falls clear. Millimetre fragments can slip free and still refuse to build the luminous veil we call a tail. Not because they lack motion, but because their scatter is dull in visible bands. The halo on the screen stays compact, and the air between stars remains undecorated. If light stays chained to the shape of the instrument, then the profile we measure echoes the telescope's own neat form. Images co-add. The width holds near the point we expect, and any outflow that exists must be close to the core or too faint to trouble the field. I tilt the stacks and stretch the contrast. The mist does not billow. It clings like breath on glass. If rotation is slow, the day lengthened to many hours, then no side faces the star long enough to break into busy flares. Brightness rises and falls with a steady hand, as if the object were turning through a dim room where every wall has the same pale paint. Modest changes suit a body that keeps its warmth like mist under a lid, rather than letting it surge as a jet. If sunlight leaves as heat in one direction more than another, then a tiny push may follow. Whisper fine the way a warm pane moves air you cannot see. Trajectory fits do not require that push, yet they do not forbid it either. In noise and error bars, a breath can hide. Any such breath would be too small to draw a visible sign. It would be a mistouch on motion, not a shove. The ifs do not force an answer. They keep us honest, and they offer a path where patience sets the pace. When the infrared brightens and dims with the steady drift of held warmth, when gas lines stay at or below the threshold that instruments accept as silence, when the image profile continues to sit where a compact glow would sit, and when the light curve's shallow tide matches a body unhurried by spin, I let these soft conditions stand together, like veils layered one over another, each thin enough to see through, and yet, in some, strong enough to calm the urge to declare more than the night has given. The room has reached its late hush. A draught cools along the floor and curls up the leg of the desk like a strand of mist learning the shape of wood. The dome breathes out, then rests. A panel light dims by a shade you feel more than notice, and the keyboards carry a chill as if morning were idling somewhere beyond the walls. Paper lies flat. A pencil waits without rolling. The vent offers a long, smooth line of air and declines to make it a story. If tomorrow repeats this soundless weather, then our log will accept another page where the object holds its poise and the sky declines ornament. If a seam yields, even briefly, then the mist in the skin may become steam and right itself as a small feature we can frame. Until then, we count the quiet as part of the lesson, the way fog teaches distance by hiding it. There is a long, level sentence that the night asks me to keep whole. If the warmth remains gathered like mist under a well-set crust, and the grains that try the air are too coarse to paint, and the rotation turns the face slowly enough to share the heat around, and the images keep their discipline against the instrument's own shape, and the spectra leave the familiar seats of gas unfilled, and the fit to gravity's curve sits well within its careful seams, then the clean frame on the monitor is not a lack, but a description, a portrait of a traveller that prefers to hold rather than shed, and of a sky that prefers quiet edges to bright wakes. I sit with that, and let time pass. The room offers nothing to contradict it. A faint tick from a cooling latch, a small sigh in a cable run, the thin breath along the floor turns, finds the opposite wall, and smooths itself away. We can stop here, without missing anything the object would have told us, because it has already said what it wished tonight, and it said it softly. That is enough for tonight. 3 handrails of light, set low and steady, are enough to guide us. I keep a palm over each one in turn, not to grip, but to learn the temperature, because facts, like rails at night, tell you where the edge is without needing to be high or bright. We'll walk along them, letting the room stay dim and the sky stay wide. First handrail. The path is open, not looped. In the language of orbits, the curve is hyperbolic, which is just a way of saying the light we follow will not circle back into a ring around the sun. Numbers behind the masthead read greater than 1 for eccentricity. The starlight on our traveller continues outward. That alone gives this glow its passport from another star, and it does so without flourish. Second handrail. The space between our world and the visitor is kind and large. The closest pass sits far out, about 280 million kilometers in December of 2025. So even as the glow climbs a little or leans bluer, Earth remains a spectator in a distant row. A safe seat allows slow speech. We can name things without hurry when the light is comfortable on the horizon. Third handrail. The frame stays clean. Stacked images behave, profiles stay near the instrument's tidy idea of a point, and the dark beside the glow remains unbraided by a bright tail. That is a statement about light, more than about labels. It means reflection holds the stage we can see, and whatever escapes, if anything, does not paint the background in visible bands. Midway I let the room draw its own, gentler rails from light alone. A monitor puts a soft rectangle on the desk like a low lantern. A thin bar from the corridor slides under the door and rests as a pale stripe on the floor. The keyboard carries a muted sheen on the keys most used, and the others sleep in charcoal. Outside, frost on the guardrail gathers a grainy glow from a far lamp and gives it back as a narrow band. The screensaver's star field moves by millimeters, patient and faint. A cursor blinks like a heartbeat learned from a lighthouse. Behind the glass, a distant cloud thins until it is only a lighter patch of dark, and the unlit dome ribs hold their shape as if drawn in graphite. Nothing sharpens, nothing demands. The light is the soft grammar of the room. These 3 rails do not try to be a bridge. They are enough to step by. Hyperbolic motion tells us where the glow came from, in broad terms, and where it is headed, away. The safe distance tells us how to feel while we watch, calm. The clean frame tells us what kind of light we are counting, mostly the kind that returns from a surface rather than billowing from a plume. What the rails do not say is also useful. They do not name the exact mixture on the surface. They do not reveal whether a crust is tight or just tidy. They do not promise that a quiet tonight will be quiet tomorrow. Light's handrails draw a corridor. They do not furnish it, and that is fine for sleep and science both. Handrail walking is a practice in scale. It trains the eyes to separate the bright from the merely brighter. It trains the voice to say seen, not seen, and below this threshold, instead of never and always. Even colour becomes one more low rail, a shift toward blue that appears in the numbers and then stabilizes, a tone the light prefers as geometry and grain and time agree. There is a long sentence I hold in the second half of the watch, because it slows everything that needs slowing. When the line of motion writes itself as a clean, outbound arc that will not close, and the calendar's light around mid-December balances with a wide cushion of space measured in hundreds of millions of kilometers, and the images from different glass and different nights keep returning. The same compact lamp with no swept veil to feather the page. I let those 3 notes of light sit beside one another like quiet markers on a path, and I promise not to make them sing a larger song than they were meant to carry. If you find yourself drifting, the rails will keep their place. They do not move when you breathe more slowly. They do not dim when your eyes rest half closed. Facts that belong to light are good companions in that way, steady enough to lean on, soft enough not to mind when you lean. When doubt visits, because it does, and is welcome, we ask whether these rails are strong enough to hold a few more steps. Hyperbolic still? Yes. Safe distance still? Yes. Clean frame still? Yes. And if the colour thread asks for its own night later, we can follow it then. But tonight, our fingers know where the edges are. So we keep moving with small steps along these 3 notes, feeling for any change in their glow, letting them teach us how to measure without bracing and how to speak without raising the volume. And in that dim discipline, the room grows quieter and the sky nearer, while the rails stay low and warm under the hand, the quiet halo, the distant seat, the outward arc returning like a refrain, and softer each time, steadying the way our attention falls. I take hold of a single thread tonight, a quiet blue that runs through the frames and ties our attention without tightening it. It isn't neon or theatrical. It's a lean of the light toward shorter wavelengths, a tone that keeps its voice low while the numbers nod in agreement. Colour here is a measurement before it is a mood. In one column, we keep the counts through a greenish window, in another, through a redder band, and the difference between them, small, repeatable, leans the slope a shade toward blue. That slope arrived after closest sun, and then settled, not racing anywhere, just holding like a ribbon laid gently across a dark table. Early in the watch, the room keeps to the same palette. The monitor's whites cool by a fraction as the night progresses. A blue LED on the rack breathes with a faint pulse and then steadies. The corridor light under the door throws a narrow pale stripe that feels colder than it looks. A mug leaves a soft ring on the desk where condensation finds the chill. The air by the glass gains the slightest tint from the screen and gives it back to your hand when you reach for a note. Nothing changes quickly. The hue is a habit rather than a choice. One path to blue is powder-fine grain. When particles are very small compared to the light they meet, the scatter favors the short side, as if the surface preferred to whisper in cooler syllables. This doesn't prove that a spray of dust has bloomed. It simply says that if the topmost layer is sifted to a delicate texture, a blueward tilt can appear without asking for a tail. Another path is freshness. If heat or stress has turned a facet, revealing minerals that have not weathered under long radiation, that new face can reflect with a cleaner tint. Silicates can do this when newly exposed, showing a paler register in visible light, even when their more obvious fingerprints are faint at other wavelengths, and the effect feels like a cooled lamp rather than a painted wall. There is also the metal's way of speaking. Surfaces with oxidized iron or nickel, or mixtures that behave like the M-type asteroids we know, may present slopes that aren't simply redder with phase, that tilt blue in certain angles or after small renewals of skin. The analogy is imperfect. Analogues are neighbors, not twins, but it widens the set of natural things that can wear blue without dusting the field. Angle joins the story too. The way light returns to us depends on the geometry between sun, traveler, and telescope. The phase can push reflectance one way or another, and small shifts in that triangle can nudge color without changing the object itself. Sometimes a single degree is enough to lean the spectrum as the surface grains play their tiny tricks with the direction of the glare. Across nights, the thread stops deepening and holds, like a line pulled snug and then tied off with a quiet knot. That plateau is its own message. Something changed around the bright turn, then found a new balance, leaving us with a color that is different from before, but not restless after. We do not let the thread become a rope. Calibration stars cross the same filters. Their colors anchor the scale, so the object's hue is a property of the object, not a mood of the night. Backgrounds are subtracted, flats are applied, and the same small slope remains, unshowy, a fact you can carry in one hand, while the other keeps the page steady. Here is a long sentence that lets the blue walk at its own pace. When the difference between greenish and redder bands stays modest, yet consistent across instruments, and when a tilt toward blue appears after the solar turn and then chooses to rest, and when paths to that hue exist in several ordinary directions, very fine grains scattering shortward, freshly exposed silicates behaving like clean facets under a lamp, and metallic or metal-rich skins that can bend color with angle, while the spectrum remains spare where gas would normally draw its narrow signs. I take the blue, not as a banner of something rare, but as a quiet property of a surface that has reasons to look the way it does in the light we are using. It helps to remember scale. A single number called a color index compresses a landscape of microstructure into one digit after a decimal. No index can tell us alone whether the blue belongs to dust or crystal or metal. It can only wave us toward tests that care about size and angle and heat, and we have begun those tests with patience rather than with guesses dressed as certainty. The blue thread is hospitable, not urgent. It doesn't ask you to memorize names. It asks you to notice that a tone can be distinctive without being extreme. You can let it be a comfort, the way a cool evening is a comfort after a hot day. Familiar, ordinary, still worth pausing for. while we keep our tools in the bands where tone becomes count, and count becomes knowledge. If you drift, the color will wait. If you wake again, it will still be there. A gentle lean of the light that's strong enough to measure and soft enough to ignore, while your breathing sets its own slower slope. And at the edge of the watch, as the cursor blinks on a line where the numbers hold steady, the blue thins almost imperceptibly toward a paler wash, a dissolve the eye feels before it names, and the frame grows quiet with it. Step by step, we cross a deck of heat at dusk. I set one foot on the warmest plank, then another, and let the boards tell me what the day left behind. The chart in my hands is a thermal map, but I read it like a sailor reads the teak underfoot, by touch, by patience, by where the warmth lingers after the sun has slipped down the rail. Here at the bow, nearest the subsolar mark, the boards hold the highest heat. Numbers live in this corner, 600, 650 Kelvin. Yet they do not crowd the voice. They stand like coordinates on a calm sea. A skin can carry that kind of warmth without boiling over, provided the layer is thin and the hull beneath is tight. I walk a few paces aft toward the shadowed side. The temperature falls with the regularity of a tide. The interior stays cold, well under 150 Kelvin, like deep water that never feels the noon. Daylight touches centimeters, not meters. The keel remembers night even when the deck is flushed with light. The ship of heat turns slowly. That is thermal lag, the drift between what the star gives and what the surface returns, like a harbour that keeps the day's warmth into the evening and yields it back a degree at a time. A slow turn means the planks creak but don't split. The load is shared along the ribs, and the wake stays neat. I tap the handrail at a seam and listen. Stress finds edges first. Expansion in the afternoon, contraction by midnight, a quiet cycle that might open hairline gaps and then close them again when the breeze cools the boards. If a pinprick jet exists, it would be like a tiny weep at a seam. Real, local, and too small to paint a foam trail behind the hull. I check for splinters the way an observer checks for fragments. None show. The silhouette holds. The line along the water is clean. Stacked frames agree that the vessel has not shed planks into the sea. If grit leaves at all, it rides low and heavy, more ballast than spray, unwilling to throw a white streak into the night. Now the instruments speak as if from different stations along the rail. Infrared notes the glow fading by gentle increments, not a plunge, but a glide, as if the ship was slipping from a warm current into cooler water. Visible images keep their discipline, the core compact against the stars, the wake unruffled by dust. The log reads ordinary, which is another word for steady. Midway across the deck, the room becomes its own harbour. A fan draws a slow breeze along the floorboards. Somewhere above, a cable ticks once, like rigging easing, as the air cools. The monitors hold their pale sheen like lanterns shielded behind glass. A pen rolls a centimetre and settles as if the tide had turned beneath it. Far off, the building breathes a low, even note, and the silence between sounds widens like water at slack tide. I kneel and set a fingertip to the map, where models sketch skin depth. Centimetres, they say, just enough wood to warm while the keel stays dark and cold. That shallow draught of heat explains how a deck can glow without steaming the sea. The voyage continues, the crew asleep below, the hull unchanged except for a faint creak now and then. Crossing to the lee side, I imagine the warmth leaving in the simplest manner possible, photons stepping off the deck like sailors disembarking in single file. A skew in that departure could press the hull the way a light swell nudges a bow, but if the push exists, it hides within the noise of waves and the regular flex of timbers. Here is the long stretch I walk in one breath, from bow to stern and back again. When the thermal crest at the sunward plank reaches the high hundreds of Kelvin, and yet remains a veneer only a few centimeters deep, and when the keelward depths hold to their quiet cold below 150, and when the evening's infrared fades as a gentle glide rather than a cliff, and when no splintered boards appear in the silhouettes that telescopes stack night after night, and when any small leak at a seam would send coarse grit low along the hull instead of into a bright wake, I accept that this craft can pass the hot channel with its deck warm and its sea untroubled, leaving behind not a foamy trail, but a record of temperatures that reads like a logbook filled in careful handwriting. By the time I reach the stern, the figures match the feel. The cooling trend continues. The rails ease from warm to mild. Nothing breaks into a fuss. A new night will bring a new tide of light, and the ship will take it with the same composure, warming where it must, keeping the keel cold, and letting silence do most of the work. I close the map and look toward the hatch that leads below. The corridor beyond is dim and even. The hinge doesn't complain. The latch waits. We are at the frame between warm deck and cooler cabin, and there is no need to cross just yet. I rest a hand on the jamb, the wood smooth from many watches, and pause at the threshold. I'm writing to you as if sliding a note across a quiet train table, the kind you find on a night route when the world moves, but the car hardly seems to. We've come some distance together through these frames, and I want to set a few markers on the map so you can rest without wondering whether you've missed a turn. First, safety, because it matters to the body before it can enjoy the view. Our visitor keeps to a far lane. The closest it comes is about 280 million kilometers, a roomy gap due in December of 2025, so wide that all we can do is watch with patient instruments and a calm pulse. No sirens, no detours, only measured miles between us and that small blue lamp. Second, company. It helps to place this traveller in a family, the way a road diary names the towns it passed. Years ago, Wani Umwamua crossed the map, odd and shy, with no tail and a hint of forces we still argue about. Then 2I Borisov came through, a classic with a bright, honest plume. Now Thrahai Atlas makes its passage, neither a copy of the first nor the second, but another route that teaches the system is larger than any single road we've traced. You might ask what we actually learned by going slow. The answer is, in the quiet miles. Non-detections are still mileposts. When instruments look to the usual stations where comet gases shout their names, and the boards stay blank, within known limits. Those blanks turn into edges on the map, telling us where a lane is narrow and where it widens, where the road simply hasn't opened into a bright highway yet. Our way of listening is modest on purpose. We pay attention to signal to noise like a driver scans for reflectors at the verge. It isn't glamorous, but it keeps us in our lane. We write seen, not seen, and below this level, and we resist the urge to rename the whole trip for a hill that looked taller in fog. Upper limits are good signposts. They keep the route honest, without promising vistas the weather can't deliver. The room draws into itself for a late stretch. Fans run like steady tires on smooth pavement. A relay clicks once, a turn signal that cancels itself. The monitors glow like dashboard gauges turned low. The air in the vent plays a constant, even line as if we'd found a stretch without crosswind. The building settles its weight. Pens forget to roll. A cable high above eases a knot and goes still. The silence feels like a straightaway after a bend, and it's easy to breathe there. I want you to feel how small changes can be enough. A color index that leans blue by a fraction. A profile that stays as compact as a well-kept lane marking. A light curve that lifts and settles by centimeters instead of hills. These aren't fireworks. They're the white posts that pass at regular intervals and let you know you're still on the road you meant to take. And here is a long sentence, written to carry you through the center of the night without jarring. When the charts agree that the nearest approach leaves hundreds of millions of kilometers like empty country between the traveler and our track, and when the same charts sit beside earlier logs that mention a first route without tail and a second route with one, together, showing that interstellar includes more than one kind of journey. And when the instruments mark again and again that gas lines are below a soft, stated threshold, while the shape in the images remains tight. Not because we closed our eyes, but because the road truly holds straight. I'm content to tell you that what we know is sturdy enough to lean on while you sleep, and that what we don't know has been fenced neatly for later. There's a habit in science of wanting a destination at every turn. Tonight, the destination is a good shoulder to stop on. We've done the careful driving. We've noted the markers. We've left space for what a later pass might add. That's enough for this leg. If you're drifting, you can let the data keep watch. They're slow and faithful, and don't mind if you close your eyes. The window will still hold its pale reflection. The cursor will still blink. A tiny green LED will breathe once a second the way mile markers appear and vanish from the corner of your sight. About the schedule. The best nights cluster around this month and the next. After that, distance and angle will make the road dim. Teams will share their maps and post them to the archive, and the story will live in those numbers more than in any one frame. You don't have to remember the dates. The road crew does, and the route is already chalked on their boards. If worry returns with a tug, did I misunderstand? Will I forget? Let it step off the shoulder and watch you pass. You can trust the wide gap, the tidy profile, and the quiet logs to keep their shape without your help. You can trust that if something changes, the sign will be large enough to see. You can let your shoulders drop here. The sky does too. The lab wears night, like a thin mist. Screens bloom with a low, blue-grey glow that feels cool to the skin, as if the air itself had condensed a little on the glass. The coffee is gone. The steam has long since surrendered. The spectrograph window waits in the center, patient as breath printing itself and fading from a winter pane. We are down to last light habits. Frames arrive softly, like droplets finding the same line on the window over and over until the track is clear. A stack builds, another follows, and the count of photons lands in the ledger with the modesty of frost traced along a sill. Signal to noise declines, not with a cliff, but with a hush, and that hush spreads across the room as the monitors dim their pulse a fraction. Ambience settles early. Fans exhale a faint thread that never rises to a draft. The ventilation whispers along the ceiling as if someone had drawn a pale veil from one corner to the other. A cable eases in the rafters, then remembers to be still. A pen cools where the hand left it. The dome barely thinks about moving, and then does not. The building wears its own weather, a film so fine you feel it more than hear it, and it keeps you company while the sky thins. Final stacks look like memory. The profile remains compact, the halo a kept circle, the background unbraided. If a tale wished to grow, tonight is not its hour. The colour thread holds to its paler blue. The logs speak in short, steady lines. The plots prefer horizontals to climbs. A faint graininess, honest and untroubled, becomes the texture of the watch. In the side channel, chat windows carry gentle notes from other sites. Brief checks, no alarms. Someone confirms calibration lamps behaved. Someone else uploads darks that fit like a glove. The mist in the room makes the messages feel closer, as if the building itself had leaned in to listen and chosen to nod rather than speak. Here and there, a phrase floats through the lab about naming and futures, the way fog sometimes carries a sound farther than air would when the day is bright. Inactive interstellar, a colleague types, careful to add the word proposed, and to leave the rest of the sentence simple. Not a decree, only a shared way to file the night so we can find it later. It sits beside the older names in the drawer and does not push. Mission ideas drift like condensation on the cooler side of the window. A quick response interceptor as a sketch, nothing signed. A thought about parking instruments where they can launch with less delay. A note that the tools we have did very well by patience alone. In mist, outlines are a kindness. They let you imagine shape without insisting on edges. Closer to the keyboards, a different kind of work thickens the air. Pipelines publish, archives receive. Fits, files walk themselves, via scripts, into the vaults that keep our nights for the future. One stream toward public space observatory stores, one toward the European libraries, one toward national mirrors, where students will pull them down years from now and run their own careful sums. It feels like watching breath on glass vanish and knowing the warmth is still in the room. There is a long sentence that stands up in this late shift and refuses to hurry, and I let it carry its own weight. When the last frames of the season arrive thinner and noisier, yet keep the same disciplined shape, and when the colours remain in their new, gentler balance, without leaning further, and when cross-site whispers converge on a label that is offered with small letters and an open hand rather than stamped in ink, and when mission sketches appear only as friendly fog along the edge of the whiteboard, while the actual work of the night quietly fills the archives, and when survey teams mention that their code will learn to watch for outbound paths without leaning on the old habit of hunting for bright comas, I take all of that as the atmosphere of a science that knows how to see through mist, not by claiming more than the view allows, but by keeping what the cool light gives. An engineer leans into the room long enough to adjust a panel. The click is soft, the way a latch sounds when someone has oiled it with a patient hand. The screen returns to its pale weather, and the frame on the glass looks the way it has looked for weeks. Compact, calm, uninterested in a flourish. We are not obliged to invent drama where none lives. The night does not need us to polish it to a shine. It asks instead that we notice the way information condenses when the air is quiet and leaves a film on the pane that you can read if your breath is slow. In the morning, the film will be gone, the data tucked away, and the mist of this hour will be remembered only in the even tone of a plot that never raised its voice. I add a final line to the log and resist metaphors that belong to louder weather. The object moves outward. The distance grows. The glow thins at a pace we can write without adjectives. If categories sharpen later, it will be because more light has condensed onto the glass, not because someone spoke loudly in a fog. At the end, the room expects a signal, not a speech. I save, back up, and set the scheduler to idle. A single green LED breathes once. The shutter decides it has one more long inhalation in it, and the spectrograph answers with a small, precise sound, the kind you only hear when you are very quiet. The tick is clean, like a fingertip lifting from misted glass. We can end softly here. The visitor's path stays open, hyperbolic, outbound, unbound to the sun. Its nearest pass to us came and went with a comfortable cushion, hundreds of millions of kilometers held like a quiet breath between lanes. The frames stayed disciplined, a compact halo, no resolved tail, the background unbraided. Color leaned toward blue after the turn, and then settled, a small tilt that didn't ask to be more. Spectrographs looked where comet gases speak, and mostly found hush within known limits. Infrared warmth rose and fell without drama, cooling by steps rather than drops. Photometry traced a shallow tide, the kind a slow rotation can write across a small world, sewn tight at the surface. If forces beyond gravity were present, they kept beneath the noise, more suggestion than need. Across the weeks, teams compared notes without hurry. Files moved to archives, where future hands will test their own tools, and our present notes will feel like a steady lamp left on in the corner of a familiar room. The object drifted outward. The glow thinned. The habit of careful speech held. I'm grateful you kept this long watch with me. You can let the facts rest where they are. Safe distance, compact light, gentle color, quiet spectra, and let the rest of the questions wait for other nights. If your eyes close now, nothing important will slip away. The frames will keep their shape. The numbers will keep their places. The sky will go on being patient. May your breath find an easy rhythm, and your shoulders remember how to lower. Thank you for listening, for giving attention the chance to warm the room without needing flair. Good night, and sleep well.